I knew buying 20 acres in rural Montana was the right move the moment I saw the property listing. But I had no idea that building my own private airstrip would nearly land me in a legal war with the most incompetent HOA board I'd ever encounter. My name is Connor Gallagher, and I'm a 52-year-old bush pilot who spent the last 3 decades flying cargo across Alaska. I'd saved every penny, watched my investments grow, and finally decided to retire to a piece of land where I could keep my Cessna 185 and take off whenever the hell I pleased. The property was perfect. Flat terrain, minimal trees, located just outside Billings with mountain views that would make any aviator weep. The listing made no mention of an HOA, and when I had my real estate attorney review the purchase documents, there wasn't a single covenant, condition, or restriction attached to the deed. I closed on the property in March 2024, and by April, I'd already hired a civil engineering firm to survey the land and design a proper grass runway. Nothing fancy, just a 2,500-foot strip with proper grading and drainage. I filed all the necessary paperwork with the FAA, got my location identifier approved, and even contacted the county planning department to ensure I wasn't violating any zoning ordinances. Everything came back clean. The county zoning allowed agricultural use, and private airstrips fell under that category as long as I wasn't running a commercial operation. Construction started in May. I had a crew come in with graders and compactors, and we began the process of leveling the runway surface. The weather was cooperating, the work was progressing ahead of schedule, and I was already imagining myself taking off into those big Montana skies by July. That's when I met Deborah. I was standing at the edge of the construction site, watching the graders make another pass, when a silver BMW SUV came barreling down my driveway, kicking up enough dust to obscure the mountains. The vehicle screeched to a halt about 10 feet from where I stood, and out stepped a woman in her mid-50s wearing what I can only describe as aggressive suburban chic. A pressed white blouse, khaki capris, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly fuel budget. "Excuse me," she shouted, marching toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Excuse me, are you the owner of this property?" "That would be me," I said, extending my hand. "Connor Gallagher, and you are—" She ignored my hand entirely. "I'm Deborah Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I need to know what you think you're doing here." I gestured to the obvious construction around us. "Building a runway for my plane." Her face went through about 5 different shades of red in rapid succession. "Absolutely not. You cannot build a runway here. This is a residential community, and your property is subject to HOA covenants that strictly prohibit commercial operations." "First of all," I said, keeping my voice level, "this isn't a commercial operation. It's for personal use. Second, I'm not part of any HOA. I reviewed my deed thoroughly before purchase, and there are no restrictions on it." Deborah's eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. "Every property in Meadowbrook Estates is part of the HOA. It doesn't matter what your deed says." When the development was established in 2019, all parcels within the boundaries were automatically included in the association. "Then I guess my parcel must be outside those boundaries," I replied, "because I received no HOA disclosure at closing, and my title insurance company found no encumbrances related to any homeowners association." She thrust the clipboard at me. "This is a cease and desist notice. You will halt all construction immediately, or the HOA will pursue legal action. We have rules here, Mr. Gallagher, and those rules exist to protect property values. Your little airplane hobby is not going to turn this community into some kind of rural airport. I took the clipboard and glanced at the document. It was printed on fancy letterhead with Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, emblazoned across the top in a flowing script. The letter itself was full of legal-sounding language about covenants, architectural review boards, and violation penalties. At the bottom was Deborah's signature, along with two other board members, Patricia Henderson and Margaret Chen. "I'll have my attorney review this," I said, handing the clipboard back. "But I'm telling you right now, I'm not part of your HOA. I bought this land free and clear." "We'll see about that," Deborah snapped. She spun on her heel and stalked back to her BMW, spraying gravel as she accelerated away. I immediately called my real estate attorney, Richard Moss, who'd handled the property purchase. Richard was a thorough guy, mid-60s, with a reputation for catching problems before they became lawsuits. "Connor," he said when I explained the situation, "I went through that title report with a fine-tooth comb. There's no HOA covenant on your property. But let me do some digging and see what I can find about this Meadowbrook Estates organization." While Richard investigated, I kept the construction going. I wasn't about to halt my project based on some random woman showing up with a clipboard. But over the next few days, things escalated quickly. First, I started receiving daily letters from the HOA, each one more threatening than the last. They claimed I owed 5 years of back dues, totaling $12,500. They said I needed to submit architectural plans for approval. They demanded I attend a mandatory board meeting to address my flagrant violations. Then the phone calls started. Deborah would call at 7 in the morning, screaming about how my construction equipment was disturbing the peace. Never mind that my nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and I'd verified the county noise ordinances allowed construction during normal business hours. One afternoon, I came back from running errands to find a building inspector's truck parked in my driveway. The inspector, a friendly guy named Tom, walked around the construction site with a puzzled expression. "Someone filed a complaint," he explained, "claiming you're building without permits, but I've got your file right here and everything's in order. FAA approval, engineering plans, the works. I don't know who called this in, but they're wasting everyone's time." "Let me guess," I said. "The complaint came from Deborah Whitmore." Tom's expression confirmed my suspicion. "I can't say who filed it, but yeah, look, you're good here, just keep doing what you're doing." The following week, Richard called with an update. "I've been researching this Meadowbrook Estates HOA, and things are getting interesting. The development was supposedly established in 2019 by a company called Horizon Properties LLC. According to the documents I found at the county recorder's office, they filed a declaration of covenants covering about 60 parcels of land in your area." "But not my parcel," I said. "Correct. Your property is specifically excluded from the legal description in their declaration." But here's where it gets weird. I pulled the incorporation documents for the HOA itself, and there are some serious irregularities. The filing is incomplete, several required signatures are missing, and the registered agent listed doesn't appear to exist. What does that mean? "It means," Richard said slowly, "that the HOA might not be legally incorporated at all. If that's the case, they have no authority to enforce anything, but I need to dig deeper to be sure." I felt a surge of vindication, but I kept it in check. "How long will that take?" "Give me 2 weeks. I want to do this right." In the meantime, Deborah ramped up her campaign. She organized a group of neighbors to drive past my property and honk their horns at all hours. She filed complaints with every county and state agency she could think of: environmental protection, fish and wildlife, even the fire marshal. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but it was death by 1,000 paper cuts. The final straw came when I discovered that someone had filed a fraudulent lien against my property, claiming I owed the HOA $50,000 in fines and assessments. I knew immediately it was Deborah's doing. The lien was filed through some sketchy online legal service, and it listed the Meadowbrook Estates HOA as the creditor. That's when I decided to go on the offensive. I met with Richard at his office in downtown Billings, a converted historic building with exposed brick and tall windows overlooking the Yellowstone River. He had a stack of documents spread across his conference table, each one marked with colorful sticky tabs. "Connor, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I've got news and you're going to like it." For the next hour, Richard walked me through his findings. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA, as it turned out, was a complete legal fiction. The incorporation documents filed with the Montana Secretary of State were riddled with errors and omissions. The articles of incorporation were never properly executed. The registered agent was a vacant lot in Missoula, and the required annual reports had never been filed. "But it gets better," Richard continued, pulling out another document. "The Declaration of Covenants that supposedly governs the HOA was never properly recorded. Someone tried to file it in 2019, but the county recorder rejected it because the legal description was ambiguous, and several property owners never signed the acknowledgement." "So the HOA doesn't legally exist?" I asked. "Not in any meaningful sense." "They might have a bank account and some letterhead, but they have no legal authority to enforce covenants or collect dues. Any liens or assessments they've filed are fraudulent." I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. "What's our next move?" "We file a lawsuit," Richard said. "We'll seek a declaratory judgment stating that the HOA has no legal authority over your property, and we'll demand they remove that fraudulent lien. We can also pursue claims for harassment and abuse of process." "Let's do it." Richard filed the lawsuit the following week. The complaint was a masterpiece of legal writing, laying out in excruciating detail how the Meadowbrook Estates HOA was never properly incorporated, how their covenants were invalid, and how Deborah Whitmore had engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against me. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Deborah showed up at my property the day after she was served with the lawsuit. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd brought Patricia Henderson and Margaret Chen, the other board members, along with about a dozen residents who'd apparently been convinced that my runway was going to destroy their property values. "You think you can sue us?" Deborah shrieked from the edge of my driveway. I'd installed a gate after the lien incident, and I wasn't about to open it for this crowd. "You're going to lose everything, Gallagher. We'll bury you in legal fees." I walked down to the gate, keeping my expression neutral. "Deborah, you've been served with a lawsuit because your organization is operating illegally. If you have a problem with that, take it up with your attorney." "We have every right to enforce our covenants," Patricia chimed in. She was a tall, angular woman with severe gray hair pulled into a tight bun. "This community has standards. Your covenants aren't worth the paper they're printed on," I replied. "And neither is your HOA. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." They eventually left, but not before Deborah promised to make my life a living hell. I didn't doubt her commitment. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was illuminating. Richard subpoenaed all of the HOA's financial records, incorporation documents, and board meeting minutes. What we found was a carnival of incompetence and possible fraud. The HOA had been collecting dues from residents for 5 years, totaling over $300,000, but the bank statements showed barely $15,000 remaining in the account. Where had the rest gone? The records were a mess. Unexplained transfers, payments to shell companies, and personal expenses charged to the HOA credit card. One particularly egregious example. Deborah had charged a $4,800 business trip to Las Vegas, claiming it was for an HOA conference. The conference didn't exist. Richard pulled me aside during one of our meetings. "Connor, this is bigger than just your case. This HOA has been systematically defrauding its members for years. We need to report this to the authorities." "Do it," I said. "These people have been making my life miserable." It's time they faced some consequences. Richard contacted the Montana Attorney General's office and filed a formal complaint alleging consumer fraud and embezzlement. He also reached out to several of the residents who'd been paying HOA dues and informed them of what we'd discovered. The response was swift. Within days, a group of Meadowbrook Estates residents formed a coalition demanding answers from the board. Some of them showed up at my property to apologize for participating in Deborah's harassment campaign. One couple, Jim and Susan Martinez, even brought me a homemade pie. "We had no idea what was going on," Susan said, looking genuinely distressed. "Deborah told us you were building a commercial airport and that it would bring crime and pollution. We feel like idiots." "Don't worry about it," I assured them. "You were lied to. That's on Deborah, not you." The preliminary hearing for our lawsuit was scheduled for late August. Richard was confident we'd win, but he warned me that Deborah might try something desperate. He was right. 2 nights before the hearing, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of engines. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window to see 2 pickup trucks parked on my runway. Several people were unloading something from the truck beds, but I couldn't make out what it was in the darkness. I pulled on my boots and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I headed outside. The dispatcher answered immediately. "This is Connor Gallagher at 4750 Riverbend Road. I've got trespassers on my property, and they appear to be vandalizing my runway." "Officers are on the way, sir." "Are you in immediate danger?" "I don't think so, but I'm going to confront them." "Sir, I'd advise you to wait for the deputies." But I was already walking down the driveway, flashlight in hand. As I got closer, I could see what they were doing, spreading roofing nails across the entire length of my runway. There had to be thousands of them, scattered deliberately to puncture airplane tires and make the runway unusable. "Hey!" I shouted, breaking into a run. "Get the hell off my property!" The figures scattered, jumping into the trucks and speeding away. But not before I got a clear look at the license plate of one vehicle and recognized the driver. It was Patricia Henderson. The sheriff's deputies arrived 10 minutes later and took my statement. I showed them the nails, the tire tracks, and gave them the license plate number. The deputies exchanged glances. "Mr. Gallagher," one of them said, "we're familiar with the situation between you and the HOA board. This is escalating beyond a civil dispute. We'll follow up on the license plate and file a report for criminal mischief." It took me most of the next day to clean up the nails. I rented an industrial magnet and made dozens of passes across the runway, collecting buckets full of nails. The deliberateness of the sabotage was chilling. If I'd tried to land without noticing them, it could have caused a serious accident. The hearing arrived, and I met Richard at the Yellowstone County Courthouse. The building was an imposing structure with marble columns and high ceilings that echoed with footsteps. We made our way to the assigned courtroom and found Deborah waiting with her attorney, a sweaty, nervous-looking man named Leonard Kraft. Judge Sarah Morrison presided over the hearing. She was in her early 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Richard presented our case methodically, walking the judge through the incorporation documents, the defective covenants, and the fraudulent lien. Kraft tried to argue that the procedural defects were minor technicalities and that the HOA had been operating in good faith for years. Judge Morrison cut him off. "Counsel, I've reviewed the documents. Your client's organization was never properly incorporated under Montana law. The articles of incorporation are defective, the registered agent doesn't exist, and the required filings were never made with the Secretary of State. I don't see how you can claim this HOA has any legal authority." Kraft stammered through a few more arguments, but it was clear he was drowning. Richard then introduced evidence of the harassment campaign, including the fraudulent lien, the false building code complaints, and the nail sabotage from 2 nights prior. Judge Morrison's expression darkened as she reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Kraft, is your client aware that several of these actions may constitute criminal conduct?" "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of all of these allegations until recently." "I suggest you confer with your client. This court will take a 30-minute recess." During the recess, I watched through the courtroom window as Kraft had what appeared to be a heated conversation with Deborah, Patricia, and Margaret in the hallway. Deborah was gesturing wildly, her face flushed, while Kraft kept shaking his head. When we reconvened, Kraft looked defeated. "Your Honor, my clients wish to withdraw their opposition to the declaratory judgment. They acknowledge that the HOA was not properly incorporated and that they will take immediate steps to remove any liens or encumbrances on Mr. Gallagher's property." Judge Morrison nodded. "Very well. I'm entering a declaratory judgment in favor of the plaintiff. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, is hereby declared to have no legal authority over Mr. Gallagher's property or any other property in the purported development. All liens, assessments, and fines imposed by the HOA are declared null and void. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to cease all collection activities immediately." She paused, looking directly at Deborah. "Miss Whitmore, I'm also referring this matter to the county attorney for investigation of possible criminal charges. The evidence of harassment and property damage presented today is deeply troubling." Deborah's face went pale. She looked like she wanted to say something, but Kraft put a restraining hand on her arm. Richard and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Montana sunshine. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. "Congratulations," Richard said, shaking my hand. "You're officially free of the HOA." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait and see what the county attorney does. Based on the evidence, I'd expect criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and criminal mischief at minimum." Over the following weeks, the fallout from the lawsuit spread through the community like wildfire. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article titled, "Meadowbrook Estates HOA Declared Invalid, Board Under Investigation for Fraud." The article detailed the incorporation failures, the financial mismanagement, and the harassment campaign against me. The residents who'd been paying dues to the HOA for years were furious. Several of them filed their own lawsuits seeking reimbursement of the dues they'd paid to a legally non-existent organization. Others contacted the IRS, questioning whether the HOA had been properly reporting income and paying taxes. The county attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, took the case seriously. She convened a grand jury to investigate the HOA's financial records. The investigation uncovered even more problems than Richard had found: forged signatures on contracts, kickbacks from vendors, and systematic embezzlement. In October, the grand jury returned indictments against Deborah Whitmore, Patricia Henderson, and Margaret Chen. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and criminal mischief. Each woman faced up to 10 years in prison if convicted on all counts. The arraignment was a media circus. I attended out of curiosity and watched as Deborah, Patricia, and Margaret were led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Deborah looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past few months. Her designer clothes had been replaced with an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, and her perfectly coiffed hair hung limp around her face. The judge set bail at $100,000 for each defendant. Deborah's husband, a successful insurance broker, posted her bail immediately, but Patricia and Margaret had to wait several days before family members could scrape together the money. The criminal trial was scheduled for January 2025, but I didn't wait for the legal process to conclude before finishing my runway. By November, the grass had taken root beautifully, and I'd installed proper lighting and wind indicators. I filed the final paperwork with the FAA and received official approval to operate. On a crisp December morning, with fresh snow dusting the mountains, I fired up my Cessna 185 and taxied to the end of the runway. The engine purred smoothly, and the grass strip looked perfect. I advanced the throttle, felt the acceleration press me back into the seat, and lifted off into the Montana sky. The feeling was indescribable. After months of fighting, harassment, and legal battles, I was finally doing exactly what I'd moved here to do. I circled over my property, looking down at the runway that had caused so much trouble, and felt nothing but satisfaction. The criminal trial began on schedule in January. I was called as a witness and spent several hours on the stand describing the harassment campaign, the fraudulent lien, and the nail sabotage. The prosecutor, an assistant county attorney named Michael Brooks, was thorough and professional. The defense attorneys tried to paint their clients as well-meaning volunteers who'd made innocent mistakes, but the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records showed clear patterns of embezzlement. The forged signatures were proven through handwriting analysis. And the nail sabotage was captured on a neighbor's security camera, showing Patricia Henderson's truck at the scene. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major counts. Deborah, Patricia, and Margaret were each sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. They were also ordered to pay restitution to the residents who'd been defrauded, totaling over $280,000. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge announced the prison terms, Deborah broke down sobbing. Patricia stared straight ahead, her face blank. Margaret looked like she was in shock. As the bailiffs led them away, Deborah turned and looked directly at me. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she just shook her head and disappeared through the door. After the sentencing, several of the Meadowbrook Estates residents approached me with a proposal. They wanted to form a legitimate property owners association, properly incorporated and governed by sensible bylaws. They asked if I'd be interested in joining. I thought about it for about 3 seconds before declining. "No offense," I told Jim Martinez, who'd become the de facto leader of the group, "but I bought this land specifically because it had no HOA. I'm happy to be a good neighbor, but I'm not interested in signing up for any kind of association, even a legitimate one." Jim laughed. "Can't say I blame you after what you went through, but the offer stands if you change your mind." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I flew several times a week, exploring the mountains and valleys of Montana from the air. I met other pilots at regional fly-ins and made friends in the aviation community. Some of them started using my runway as an emergency alternate, and I was happy to help out. The vacant lot where Deborah's house had stood eventually sold at auction to pay restitution to the fraud victims. A young couple from Seattle bought it and built a modest cabin. They introduced themselves shortly after moving in, and I was relieved to find they were normal, reasonable people with no interest in telling me what I could or couldn't do with my own property. One afternoon in April 2025, almost exactly a year after construction on the runway had begun, I was working in my hangar when a familiar pickup truck pulled into my driveway. It was Tom, the building inspector who'd checked my permits during the initial harassment campaign. "Connor," he called out, walking over with a grin. "I heard you won your case. Congratulations." "Thanks, Tom. What brings you out here?" "Just wanted to see the finished product." He looked at the runway, which was looking particularly good with the spring grass coming in thick and green. "Mind if I take a walk around? Be my guest." We strolled the length of the runway while I explained the engineering work, the drainage systems, and the lighting setup. Tom was genuinely interested, asking technical questions and taking photos. "You know," he said as we walked back toward the hangar, "this whole situation taught me something. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of HOA disputes, but I've never seen one where the HOA itself was completely fake. Makes you wonder how many other associations out there are operating outside the law." "That's a scary thought," I said. "Tell me about it." "After your case hit the news, I started looking more carefully at HOA complaints that come across my desk. You'd be surprised how many of them involve associations that can't produce proper documentation when challenged." We talked for a while longer before Tom headed back to his office. The conversation stuck with me, though. How many other property owners were being bullied by HOAs that had no legal authority? How many people paid fines and dues to organizations that were nothing more than elaborate frauds? I thought about writing an article or starting a blog to share my experience, but ultimately decided against it. I'd had enough of being in the public eye. Instead, I focused on what I'd moved to Montana to do: fly, enjoy the mountains, and live life on my own terms. The following months brought occasional reminders of the battle I'd fought. Every now and then, someone would recognize my name from the news articles and want to hear the story firsthand. I'd tell them the basics, emphasizing the importance of doing proper due diligence before buying property and never assuming that an HOA has legitimate authority just because it claims to. One memorable encounter happened at a fly-in breakfast in Great Falls. I was pouring syrup over a stack of pancakes when a woman in her 40s approached my table. "Excuse me, are you Connor Gallagher?" she asked hesitantly. "That's me. I just wanted to thank you. I read about your case last year, and it inspired me to challenge my own HOA. They'd been trying to fine me for painting my house the wrong shade of yellow. I demanded to see their incorporation documents, and guess what? They couldn't produce them. Turns out they'd never properly filed with the state either." "What happened?" I asked. "The HOA folded, just disbanded entirely once I threatened to sue. I'm living HOA free now, just like you." Stories like that made the whole ordeal feel worthwhile. If my experience had helped even one other person stand up to an illegitimate HOA, then all the stress and harassment had served a purpose. By summer, the runway was seeing regular use. I'd connected with a group of bush pilots who liked to meet up for weekend flying trips, and my property became one of our informal gathering spots. We'd fly into remote backcountry strips, camp under the stars, and swap stories about close calls and memorable flights. During one of these gatherings, a pilot named Steve asked me about the HOA situation. I gave him the short version, focusing on the legal issues rather than the personal drama. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "that's insane. I've dealt with some difficult HOAs before, but at least they were legitimate organizations. I can't imagine fighting with a fake HOA." The crazy part, I replied, is that it was only fake technically. These people really believed they had authority. They collected dues, held meetings, elected officers. They just never bothered to file the proper paperwork to make it legal. Sounds like a lot of HOAs, honestly. Another pilot chimed in. Half of them are just busybodies looking for an excuse to control their neighbors. The conversation drifted to other topics, but it reinforced something I'd come to believe. HOA, even legitimate ones, often attract people who crave power and control. Give someone a clipboard and a title like HOA president, and suddenly they think they're running a small nation. As autumn arrived and the aspens turned gold against the dark green pines, I reflected on everything that had happened since I'd bought the property 18 months earlier. The battle with Deborah and her fake HOA had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had also been strangely clarifying. I'd learned that standing up for your rights, even when it's difficult and expensive, is worth it in the end. I'd also learned the importance of thorough research and documentation. If I hadn't had Richard review the title so carefully, if I hadn't kept records of every interaction with the HOA, if I hadn't photographed the nail sabotage, things might have turned out very differently. One October morning, I received a letter from the Montana State Prison. It was from Margaret Chen, the former HOA board member who'd seemed the least malicious of the three. She'd written to apologize for her role in the harassment campaign and to explain her perspective. In the letter, Margaret described how she joined the HOA board thinking it would be a good way to meet neighbors and contribute to the community. Deborah had recruited her, promising that the board work would be minimal and mostly social. Margaret claimed she'd had no idea about the embezzlement or the fraudulent incorporation until it all came to light during the lawsuit. I should have asked more questions, she wrote. I should have demanded to see financial records and legal documents. I trusted Deborah because she seemed confident and knowledgeable, but that was a terrible mistake. I'm deeply sorry for the harm we caused you, and I hope you can forgive me someday. I read the letter several times, trying to decide how I felt about it. On one hand, Margaret had participated in the harassment, including driving by my property to honk horns and filing false complaints. On the other hand, she genuinely seemed to have been manipulated by Deborah. I decided to write back. Not to offer forgiveness exactly, but to acknowledge her apology and wish her well. I kept it brief. I appreciate you writing. What happened was wrong, but I believe people can learn from their mistakes. I hope you find a better path forward. Whether she ever received the letter, I don't know. But writing it gave me a sense of closure. As winter set in and snow blanketed the runway, I switched to skiing and used the quiet months to plan flying trips for the following spring. The Cessna sat snug in the hangar, waiting for better weather. I spent evenings reading by the fireplace, occasionally glancing at the framed news article on my wall, the one about the fake HOA and the Bush pilot who'd exposed their fraud. Sometimes I wondered what Deborah was thinking as she sat in her cell. Did she regret her actions? Did she understand how badly she'd overstepped? Or did she still believe she'd been in the right, fighting to preserve property values and community standards? I'd probably never know, and I realized I didn't really care. Deborah and her fake HOA were part of my past now, a story I'd tell at parties and a reminder to always verify official-sounding claims. Spring returned, and with it came the joy of flying season. I pulled the Cessna out of the hangar, performed a thorough pre-flight inspection, and took off into clear blue skies. The mountains were still snow-capped, and the valleys below were coming alive with wildflowers. As I flew over Meadowbrook Estates, I could see the development spread out below. Houses with neat yards, cars in driveways, people going about their lives. Without the fake HOA, they'd formed a voluntary neighborhood watch and organized occasional social events. From what I'd heard, the community was actually thriving now that Deborah's authoritarian rule had ended. I banked the Cessna and headed west, toward the mountains. The runway that had caused so much conflict was now just a useful piece of infrastructure, a grass strip where I could land and take off whenever I wanted. No permission needed, no architectural review board, no HOA president with a clipboard and a power complex. Just me, my plane, and the endless Montana sky. That evening, as I secured the Cessover in the hangar and locked up for the night, I paused to look at the property I'd fought so hard to keep free. The runway stretched out in the fading light, the grass rippling in the breeze. Beyond it, the mountains turned purple and gold in the sunset. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in Richard's office, reviewing legal documents and planning strategy. I thought about the stress of the harassment campaign, the anger I'd felt discovering the nails scattered across my runway, and the satisfaction of watching Judge Morrison declare the HOA invalid. But mostly, I thought about how grateful I was to have trusted my instincts and fought back. A lot of people would have given up when faced with the pressure Deborah and her board applied. They would have stopped construction, paid the fines, and accepted the HOA's authority just to make the conflict go away. I'm not one of those people. When I know I'm right, I dig in. And in this case, digging in had revealed a fraud that had been operating for years, harming dozens of families who'd paid dues to an organization that had no legal right to collect them. The civil lawsuits filed by other residents eventually settled for pennies on the dollar. Deborah, Patricia, and Margaret had no assets left after paying criminal restitution and legal fees. The homeowners who'd paid dues learned an expensive lesson about the importance of verifying that an HOA is legitimate before writing checks. As for Horizon Properties LLC, the company that had supposedly established the development, it turned out to be a shell corporation created by Deborah's husband. He managed to avoid criminal charges by cooperating with investigators and claiming ignorance of his wife's activities, but his reputation in the Billings business community was destroyed. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona to start over. The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Montana's legislature passed new laws requiring HOAs to file annual reports with the Secretary of State and maintain transparent financial records. Several other communities in the state investigated their own HOAs and discovered similar problems with incorporation and governance. I'd inadvertently started a movement, though I'd never intended to be any kind of activist. I just wanted to build a runway and fly my plane in peace. 3 years after the initial confrontation with Deborah, I received word that she'd been granted parole. Patricia and Margaret had already been released, and both had moved out of state. I never heard from any of them again. Life on the property continued to be everything I'd hoped it would be. The runway became something of a local landmark, known among pilots throughout the region as a reliable alternate strip with a friendly owner. I hosted fly-ins, helped student pilots practice short field landings, and assisted with search and rescue operations when needed. The neighbors in Meadowbrook Estates, freed from Deborah's tyrannical rule, turned out to be good people. We weren't close friends, but we looked out for each other. When Jim Martinez's barn caught fire, I helped organize a work party to rebuild it. When Susan needed a ride to Billings for medical appointments, I flew her there in the Cessna. This was the kind of community I'd always wanted. Voluntary cooperation between independent property owners, with no coercive HOA dictating paint colors and lawn care schedules. As I sit here now, Looking out at the runway that started this whole adventure, I feel nothing but contentment. I won my fight against a fake HOA, exposed their fraud, and helped protect other property owners from similar schemes. My runway is operational, my plane is ready to fly, and I answer to no one but myself and the FAA. That's exactly how it should be. And if Deborah Whitmore had spent less time trying to control her neighbors and more time ensuring her HOA was actually legitimate, she might not have ended up in prison. But that's not my problem anymore. I have flying to do.